I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Denny's on Christmas Eve, and I didn't go inside for a long time. I'd driven 40 minutes in the dark, on roads I barely remembered, because my son had called me 3 days before and told me not to come. Not in a mean way. That's what made it worse. He wasn't angry. His voice was calm, almost apologetic, like he was canceling a dentist appointment. He said his wife's family was coming in from Portland, and things were already tight. He said maybe we could do something in January. He said he'd call me. I sat there with the engine running and the heat blowing, and I thought about the turkey I'd already bought. It was still in my refrigerator at home, thawed, sitting in a pan I'd never use. I was 63 years old, and I was sitting in a Denny's parking lot on Christmas Eve because my son's wife didn't want me at the table. I finally went in. It was one of those Denny's that never closes, the kind that always has a few people in it who have nowhere else to be. A trucker at the counter, a young woman with tired eyes refilling her coffee, two teenagers in a back booth who looked like they'd walked in from the cold just to sit somewhere warm. The place smelled like syrup and burnt coffee, and I found a booth near the window and sat down. The waitress who came to my table was a woman maybe 10 years younger than me, short silver hair, name tag that said Roz. She had the look of someone who had worked a lot of holidays and made peace with it long ago. She said, "Just you tonight, honey?" I said yes. She didn't say anything else. She just wrote down my order. Turkey dinner, the special, which felt like a small, cruel joke, and walked back toward the kitchen. I watched the parking lot. A minivan pulled in. A family got out, bundled in coats, a little kid in a red hat. They came through the door laughing about something, all of them laughing, and they took the big booth in the center of the room. I looked out the window again. Somewhere between my coffee arriving and my food arriving, I became aware of a table I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe they'd come in while I was looking at my phone. I wasn't sure. But it was a family, a large one, spread across two tables they'd pushed together. An older woman at the head, a man about my age across from her. Younger people, grown kids probably, a couple of them with children of their own on their laps, or in booster seats dragged from the car. They were loud in the way that only people who genuinely like each other can be loud, not performing, just present. The older woman at the head of the table looked over at me. She didn't look away. She smiled and gave a small nod, the kind of nod that says, "I see you." I nodded back and looked down at my plate. My food was fine. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. I ate half of it. I pushed the rest around. Roz refilled my coffee without being asked. I was reaching for my wallet when I heard the chair beside me scrape the floor. I looked up. It was the older woman from the big table. She was standing next to my booth, holding a glass of water she didn't need, looking at me with an expression I didn't have a name for right away. It wasn't pity. It was something older than that. She said, "I hope you'll forgive me. My husband and I, we noticed you sitting here, and we had a feeling you might want some company. We have more than enough food and more than enough room, and it would truly make our Christmas if you'd join us." I opened my mouth to say no. I had a whole polite decline ready to go. "Thank you so much. That's very kind. I'm actually just heading out." What came out instead was, "Are you sure?" she said. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Her name was Bette. Her husband was a man named Sullivan. Sully, everyone called him, who stood up when I walked over and shook my hand like we were old friends, finally meeting in person. Their daughters were there, and their daughters' husbands, and 3 grandchildren who were too young to care about anything except the dessert menu. There was a son-in-law who coached Little League and wouldn't stop talking about it in the best way. There was a daughter who was a nurse and kept laughing at things that weren't that funny, but she had the kind of laugh that made you laugh too. They moved the chairs around and made space for me, and someone handed me a plate of food that had been clearly prepared at home and brought in. Real food, the kind that takes all day. I sat there at that table in that Denny's on Christmas Eve, and I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. After a while, Bette asked me what I did before I retired. I told her I'd been a civil engineer for 32 years. Bridges, mostly. I told her my wife had passed 6 years earlier. I told her I had a son about an hour away and a daughter out in Phoenix who called every Sunday without fail. She nodded like she understood the weight of everything I'd left out. Sully asked if I liked football. I said I did. He said that was all he needed to know about a man. We stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty. Roz brought us all coffee, and Bette tipped her what I'm guessing was more than the bill. When we finally stood to leave, Bette wrote something on the back of a receipt and pressed it into my hand. It was her phone number and her address. She said, "We do dinner every Sunday. You come whenever you want. The door is always open." I drove home that night in the dark, and I thought about what had just happened. I thought about my son's voice on the phone, calm and flat. I thought about the turkey still in my refrigerator. I thought about the way Sully had laughed at something I said, really laughed, like I was someone worth laughing with. I kept the receipt. The call came in February. My son's voice on the phone was the same as always. Not cold exactly, but thin. Like a conversation being had out of obligation, the minimum required to say he had called. We talked for 8 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when he hung up. He didn't ask how my Christmas was. I didn't tell him. What I did instead, the following Sunday, was drive to Bette and Sully's house. It was a 2-story place in a neighborhood with old trees, the kind that have roots that buckle the sidewalk. Bette answered the door in an apron and acted like I'd been coming every week for years. Dinner was pot roast. The nurse daughter, her name was Penny, was there, and the son-in-law with the Little League obsession, whose name was Burke, and 2 of the 3 grandchildren because the third had an ear infection. Sully poured me a glass of wine and put the game on in the other room. After dinner, when the grandchildren were asleep on the couch under a blanket and everyone else was at the table with their coffee, Bette said, "Tell me about your wife." Nobody had asked me that in a long time. Most people talked around her like she was a hole in the floor. But Bette asked, and I told her. I told her about how my wife used to hum to herself when she was reading. Not songs exactly, just sound, and it used to drive me crazy, and I would give anything to hear it again. I told her about how she had grown tomatoes every summer in pots on the back porch, and how I still bought tomatoes at the store even though I never ate them. I just felt like I should have them. Penny put her hand on the table, not on my hand, just near it. Sully said, "She sounds like a hell of a woman." I said she was. I drove home at 9 o'clock and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly. More like ballast. Like something had been shifted back into place. I went back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. My son called in March asking if I could lend him some money. He said it wasn't a big deal. He said they were between paychecks and his wife's car had needed a new transmission, and the timing was just bad. He said he'd pay me back by May, June at the latest. I told him I needed to think about it. There was a pause, not a long one. He said, "Okay, sure, just let him know." I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about Christmas Eve in the parking lot and the Denny's and Raws asking just you tonight, honey. I thought about the 8-minute phone call in February. I thought about everything my son had not asked and had not said. I called him back and told him I couldn't do it right now. I told him my finances were tighter than he probably realized. I kept my voice even and neutral, the same way his had been on the phone in December. He said he understood. He hung up in 5 minutes. He didn't call again for 11 weeks. In April, Bette's youngest granddaughter had a birthday, and I was invited. I almost didn't go. I stood in the kitchen of my house that Saturday morning, and I thought, these are not your people. You met this woman in a Denny's 4 months ago. There is something strange about this. You should not get attached. I went anyway. The birthday was in their backyard. Streamers on the fence. A cake that had a horse on it because apparently the little girl had decided she loved horses above all other things. I stood there with a juice box in my hand, watching her run across the yard, and I thought about my own son at that age. He used to run the same way, all arms, no coordination, like every direction at once. I found myself next to Burke, the Little League coach. He handed me a plate of potato salad and said, "They talk about you, you know, Bette and Sully. They say you're good people." I didn't know what to do with that, I said. "They're pretty good people themselves." He nodded. "Yeah, they are, Bette especially. She has a way of seeing people. I think she saw me from about 10 feet away the first time I came to Sunday dinner, and I was terrified of her for like 6 months, and now she's my favorite person on earth." We stood there eating potato salad and watching the little girl try to blow out her candles 3 times before they finally stayed out. That night I called my daughter in Phoenix. She picked up on the second ring like she always did. I told her about Bette and Sully and the Sunday dinners, and she listened the way she always listened, all the way to the end without interrupting. She said, "Dad, I'm glad." I said, "I know." She said, "How's your brother?" She meant my son. She always called him my brother, even to me, because that was easier than the alternative. I told her he was fine, as far as I knew. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You deserve people who show up, Dad." I didn't say anything. She said, "I mean that." I knew she did. Summer passed the way summer does when you're retired and live alone. Slow mornings. Work in the yard. The news, which I was trying to watch less of. Sundays at Bette and Sully's, around which the rest of my week turned, without my fully realizing it. My son called twice in June, once to say he'd be in the area, and maybe we could get lunch. We met at a sandwich place off the highway, and sat across from each other for 45 minutes, and I could feel the whole time that there was something he wanted to ask, but wasn't asking yet. He kept steering the conversation toward money, not directly, but the way you approach something you're nervous about. The cost of things, his neighborhood, the market, his wife's hours at work being cut. I didn't take the bait. We hugged in the parking lot, and he said we should do this more often. He called again 3 weeks later. This time he said it straight. He needed $15,000. He and his wife had been working with a financial counselor, he said, and they had a plan, and this would bridge the gap while they got things sorted out. He said he'd pay me back within the year. I sat with the phone against my ear, and I looked out the window at my backyard. I said, "What happened to paying me back what you borrowed in February?" He reminded me that I had told him I couldn't help him in February. I said, "That's right, I did." Another pause. He said, "Dad, I really need this." I said I understood. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't do it. I told him I loved him, and I hoped things got easier soon. He said he had to go. He hung up before I could say goodbye. It was September when Penny told me they'd gotten a cancer scare with Sully. They'd caught it early. He'd need surgery and some treatment, but the prognosis was good. She told me at Sunday dinner before he came downstairs, because she wanted me to know so I wouldn't react wrong when I saw him. I said, "What do you need?" She said, "Just what you've been doing. Come Sundays. It matters to him." I came every Sunday. Sometimes I came on Tuesdays, too, when Bette needed someone to drive her to the hospital because Penny was working. I sat in a lot of waiting rooms that fall. I learned which chairs were comfortable and which vending machines had the decent coffee. Sully and I got into a habit of watching the game on a small TV in his hospital room, muted with bad lip reading we invented ourselves. He made it through. The Sunday he came home, really home, done with the last treatment, all clear. Bette made a dinner that didn't fit on one table. She pushed every table they had into the living room. There were 14 people crowded in that house, and everyone was talking at once. And at some point Sully looked across the room at me and raised his glass. I raised mine back. I drove home that night thinking, this is the thing. This is the thing I didn't know I was looking for when I walked into that Denny's. The following spring, my daughter called to tell me she was getting married. She said his name was Perry. She'd been seeing him for almost 2 years. She apologized for not telling me sooner. She said she hadn't been sure where things were going, and then suddenly she was sure, and she wanted to tell me in person. But then the pandemic had made that harder, and then it was just never the right time. I told her to stop apologizing and just tell me about him. She did. He sounded like someone who made her laugh. He sounded like someone who took her seriously. She said he made very good chili, which was one of her criteria, apparently. I told her I couldn't wait to meet him. She said the wedding was going to be small, late June, in Phoenix. About 40 people. I said I would be there. Then she said, "I already told your brother. I wanted you both to know at the same time." I said, "How did that go?" A small pause. She said, "He said he wasn't sure if he could make it. Something about work." I didn't say anything. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know, sweetheart." The wedding was at a botanical garden, the kind in the desert, with the tall cacti and the orange rock paths, and the light in the late afternoon that makes everything look like it was lit for a painting. My daughter wore a dress that I can only describe as exactly right. Perry stood at the end of the path, and his face when he saw her was the face of a man who still could not believe his own luck, and I thought, good. That's what she deserves. I was seated in the front row with her future in-laws, people I'd met twice and liked immediately. We shook hands and made small talk, and then the music started and I stopped being able to talk at all. When I walked her down that path, she held my arm with both hands. She leaned in at some point and said quietly, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." I said, "There's nowhere else I'd be." I meant it in a way I don't think I fully understood until I said it. The reception was in a courtyard, round tables with candles, a bar that stayed busy, dancing that started slow and got less slow as the night went on. I danced once, with Bette, who had flown in from home because my daughter had asked her to, which I had not known was going to happen, and which undid me a little when I saw her walk in. Bette danced surprisingly well for a woman who claimed she didn't. It was near the end of the night, when most of the guests had settled into that comfortable stage where nobody is leaving, but nobody is starting anything new, that my son appeared. He had come after all. He stood in the entrance to the courtyard in a jacket that looked like he'd bought it that morning, looking at the room like he was searching for something to recognize. He found me, eventually. He walked over. He said, "You look good, Dad." I said, "She looks better." He smiled at that. He looked at his sister across the room, dancing with her new husband, and something moved across his face that I didn't try to name. We stood there for a while. He got a drink. I had one already. Bette came over, and I introduced her, and I watched my son try to process who this woman was, and how she knew me, and why she was flying to his sister's wedding, and I could see him putting it together. The Sunday dinners, the hospital, the last year and a half of my life that he had not been part of. He said, "I didn't know you had people like this." I said, "A lot has happened since Christmas." He said, "The Christmas you spent alone." I said, "I didn't end up alone." He was quiet for a moment. The music changed. His sister laughed at something across the room. He said, "I haven't been a very good son, have I?" I looked at him. He was 41 years old. He had his mother's nose and my stubbornness and a marriage that had made him smaller than he used to be. I thought, though I had never said that out loud. I said, "I think you've been doing the best you could with what you had." He didn't say anything. I said, "I also think you have more than you've been using." He looked down at his drink. After a moment he said, "I'm sorry about the money, both times." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry about Christmas." I said, "I know that too." He looked up. He said, "What do I do now?" I said, "You could start by calling me when you don't need anything." He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet. He's always hated that, getting emotional in public, since he was a little boy. He blinked it away. He said, "Okay." I said, "And you could meet Bette and Sully sometime. Have Sunday dinner." He looked over at Bette, who was talking to someone's grandmother, with the full intensity of a person who talks to everyone like they're interesting. He said, "She seems like a lot." I said, "She's exactly enough. I don't know what happens from here. I don't know if my son and I find our way back to something real, or if we manage something less than that, a version of closeness that we both have to construct carefully, because the natural kind got lost somewhere over the years. I don't know if his marriage stays the shape it is or changes. I don't know how much of what he said that night was the candlelight and the open bar, and seeing his sister so clearly happy. What I know is that I drove out of that botanical garden at 11 o'clock at night, with the desert air coming through the windows and the lights of Phoenix spread out ahead of me, and I felt like a man who had not been erased. I felt like a man who had, somewhat accidentally in a Denny's on Christmas Eve, with a plate of food he couldn't taste, found out who he was again. Bette texted me from the hotel at midnight. She sent a photo of the dancing, one she'd taken on her phone, blurry and warm, the lights strung overhead. At the edge of the frame, almost out of it, were my son and me, standing together looking at the room. She wrote, "Good things are still coming, my friend." I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I put the phone down and drove toward home, through the dark and the desert and the long open miles of a night that felt, for the first time in longer than I could name, entirely mine.